Hey Tarun, how are you?
Hey Roderick, how are you? Great to be here.
Yeah. All right, let's get started. Um, intents have emerged as a narrative sometime last year and or a big theme now. You had some recent research from a couple of months ago that explored a new concept called intent-based markets that could potentially address some of the challenges faced by decentralized exchanges. So could you please break down what intent-based markets are and how they differ from the current prevailing DEX model?
Yeah, I think one way of thinking about intent markets is as generalization of request for quote systems. So requests for quote systems are generally systems where there's one side of the market that's a market maker who offers a quote. There's one side that's a user. The user says, "Hey, what quote can I get?" Market makers give a quote, and then the user says, "Okay, I accept or I reject." In that kind of sequence of steps, there's a bunch of different communication, right? So there's, the user communicating to the market maker doing some calculation, taking data from different venues and then quoting a price. And then finally there's the user accepting or rejecting the bid. In that sense, it's a non-atomic transaction. It has multiple transactions that there's different rounds of communication. And if one of those rounds gets interrupted, the transaction could fail. Generally, decentralized exchanges on chain, like Uniswap or Curve, are atomic in that they quote you a price and they automatically execute you at a particular price all in one operation. There's not this back and forth between you and the operator. And there's some benefits and some negatives to that. The benefits are atomic transactions generally are able to really run in this like fully trustless manner in that one side of the market, namely the market makers who are quoting, can be completely passive. So liquidity providers can take assets they have, they can lock it into a smart contract, and the contract automatically quotes and fulfills the order. On the other hand, their negatives are that they generally have worse prices because they require arbitrageurs, people who are trading against this market, to trade against other markets to keep the prices synchronized. And in general, always need some amount of arbitrage, but these mechanisms tend to need more arbitrage because there's no way for the liquidity providers to respond as efficiently. So intent markets have sort of been a popular sort of buzzword, and in some cases actually used. So I think the two biggest intent markets are Uniswap X and CowSwap. Both of these markets still use decentralized exchanges that are these atomic sort of on-chain mechanisms as a sort of backstop, but they allow sort of some types of users called solvers to compete to give users the best price. So these mechanisms tend to combine both to try to get the best of both worlds. I think there's been a huge amount of hype and interest in intent markets because they aim to kind of bridge the gap between centralized exchanges and decentralized exchanges. Oftentimes, the user experience on decentralized exchanges is significantly worse than centralized exchanges, partially because the prices are not as good, but also partially because exactly how your transaction gets executed is not as predictable. And intents sort of aim to bridge this gap.
Okay. So I mean the difference is you now have a kind of more active type of participant in intent markets, so-called solvers. And your paper introduced a couple of mathematical models that studied the behavior of solvers. So what were the main takeaways from analyzing these models and behavior of these participants?
Yeah, so I think one thing to think about is that one of the reasons we wrote this paper, to give some sort of high level context, was there was a lot of uh, buzz and kind of hype around intents that sort of was like, hey, we have all these on chain mechanisms. they're sort of inefficient in some way. Either they are capital inefficient, they're pricing inefficient, they are, latency inefficient if it takes a while to confirm a transaction. And if our goal, especially post FTX, is to like try to move a large portion of trading of crypto assets on chain, then we need to have mechanisms that allow you to get centralized exchange experience. And generally, people kind of jump to the conclusion that, hey, these kind of existing centralized exchange models, whether they're order books or whether they're kind of requests for quote systems, could be adapted to be used on chain. Now, a natural question is there a limit to how well they can actually perform? Because you still have some inherent costs in decentralized systems, and those costs can still affect these strategic participants like solvers, not just the non-strategic participant who is, trying to buy Pepe or WIF on chain and doesn't really care what price they get. So one question that we were kind of concerned about is, if you think about Uniswap, when I'm a liquidity provider in Uniswap, I take some assets, I lock them into the smart contract, and then the smart contract exchanges, asset A for asset B or asset B for asset A, depending on what I request. It's a pro-rata model in the sense that all of the liquidity providers are treated effectively equal, more or less. Now, there's some nuance to that in Uniswap v3, but for simplicity, you can really think of it as like, I put in $1 and you put in $1,000. I should still be getting 1/1001 times whatever the fees or trading behavior is. This notion of pro rata sharing of orders and fees is not what happens in strategic liquidity provision. If I think about market makers in an order book, market makers in an order book are competing with one another to provide quotes, and they want to oftentimes be the first ones to add new orders at a higher price. And they also want to be the first ones to cancel orders when a price is stale or people are not trading at that price. And this implicitly means that different market makers of different skill levels, of different infrastructure levels, will have different expected earnings of fees or different sort of outcomes. And so one question you might ask is, in these intent markets, because they bring some of this competitive behavior between solvers who you could think of as sort of like market makers on chain, do you still have this kind of, how kind of unfair is it? How different is it between the different solvers and participants? And what we find is sort of there's a natural manner in which you can oftentimes have an oligopoly in these systems. And the oligopoly is not necessarily from explicit collusion or something kind of improprietous, as you might expect more in the centralized world. But the oligopoly actually comes from congestion. So if all the market makers are competing for the same inventory, so let's say there's 100 WIF on Binance that's currently on the order book, and someone on chain requests 90 WIF on chain, and if there's a lot of solvers who all go to Binance to try to buy 90 WIF at the same time, they might push the price up so much that the user actually doesn't get a better price than the passive on-chain liquidity. So the question is, when do solvers compete themselves out of being more efficient? And so that was sort of what we studied and kind of found a lot of cases where, the solver market really needs an external market that's much more liquid than the on-chain market in order for them to offer better prices. And so, for the major assets, like Bitcoin or Ethereum or Solana, that's, you can really trade much higher size than you can on chain, off chain, and that's totally fine. But for low liquidity assets, these mechanisms sort of don't, the competition cost is much higher than, the liquidity provision costs, and those assets probably don't benefit from these mechanisms. And what this shows us is, these types of mechanisms, they're not one size fits all, right? They have some, they depend on the type of behaviors that the users are taking. And so as you're designing and thinking about these mechanisms, especially as people do things that are more complicated than just trading, you have to kind of think a little bit about the quality of the assets, how users are using them, et cetera. And so that's sort of one of the types of the main sort of results in this paper.
Okay, so it means, does it mean that in fact for users, it might be better in some types of markets to restrict the number of participants on the solver side?
Yeah, exactly. It basically says, restricting, in some cases, restricting the number of solvers will get you a better price.
Okay.
Now, which is counterintuitive, right? You would think that, hey, more competition means better prices, but
Yeah,
there's kind of a
that's
limit to that.
usually perceived that way. But so yeah, I mean, doesn't that kind of go against a little bit the idea of open competition and decentralization and permissionlessness and all that, right? So restricting means permissioning, right? So
well, the thing here though is that the restriction comes naturally. So what happens is you have a permissionless system. Anyone can quote a price and join. It's just that if all of those people have to source inventory to fulfill the on-chain order from the same place, and they all are competing at the same time off-chain, and they push the price up off-chain, well, then they've just made the price that they're going to deliver worse, right? And so this is actually one interesting thing about decentralized systems is you actually can have these natural oligopolies form due to congestion costs. And these congestion costs sometimes come in the form of gas costs, where they're sort of demand-based costs. Like, all decentralized systems have to have these mechanisms for regulating congestion cost. When a lot of people show up to try to do the same action, they have to increase the fees. The same thing is true in off-chain trading markets as well, right? Like instead of it being fees increasing, it's just there's no liquidity, and suddenly you have to pay a higher price to convince market makers to post liquidity or quote in that region. So the interesting thing about decentralized systems is that these congestion costs can sort of naturally limit competition. That's sort of the surprising kind of interesting finding.
Okay. One of the two models in questions that you address in your paper proposes a specific auction mechanism for intent-based markets. Can you talk about that a little bit and how it's kind of optimizes benefits for all participants and implications for market structure as a result?
For sure. I think there've been a few papers now kind of in this frame, but one thing that sort of like if let's say if I went to the 1980s or 1990s and I was thinking about auction design, most people would say second price auctions have all these really nice theoretical properties. A bunch of people won the Nobel Prize for showing them. And first price auctions and Dutch auctions, they're sort of they're not very they don't have this property that bidders bid what they want, in the sense that bidders are not incentivized to bid what they think the item is worth. They're actually incentivized to bid lower than what they think it's worth if they think everyone else is doing that same strategy. In the second price auction, where the winning bidder pays what the second highest bidder's price was, you can show in sort of a simple model that people bid what they truly think the item is worth. And so because of that, there was this intense era between, I want to say 1998 and maybe the early 2010s, where a lot of auctions that were done on the internet, so for instance, Google AdWords auctions, Facebook ads auctions, etc., were all done as second price auctions. But on the internet, unlike sort of in centralized exchanges where a lot of auctions are done as first price, so highest bidder pays the highest price, or Dutch auction where the price is lowered until someone says I want to buy it. Though those auction formats are not, the second price auction has this problem where it's not resistant to Sybil attacks and people sort of faking bids. So for instance, the auctioneer themselves could add in a bunch of fake bids and cause the price that the highest bidder is paying to be arbitrarily close to what they paid. So they've caused the second price to degrade to the first price by adding in fake bids. And this is not a hypothetical thing. Actually, the DOJ has a lawsuit right now against Google for claiming that Google actually was doing this for a long time, where Google claims that, hey, it was our optimization algorithm that accidentally added all these fake bids, but the DOJ says it was malicious. And so Google actually switched to a first price mechanism very recently. And the reason I bring this up is a lot of things in blockchains are either first price or Dutch auctions. Dutch auctions, from a theoretical economics perspective, are actually kind of bad. They have all these properties people don't like they're path dependent, and you have to pick a price that's higher than what anyone values it as. If you pick it too low at the starting price, then you've taken some loss. And the question is, like, how good are you at predicting that? You as the seller might not have any information. But if you look at blockchains in general, they tend to use these mechanisms. And part of the reason is that decentralized systems tend to do a lot better with mechanisms that have this kind of Sybil resistance property, even if people aren't paying what they value the item. Part of the reason for that is, the transaction fees you're paying are sort of oftentimes divorced from the actual value of the transaction you have. And so the chain has to construct a mechanism that's agnostic to the value of the item that is being sold or auctioned in order to kind of handle many different types of transactions and all the programmatic covenants that people write in smart contracts. So in some sense, because A, you don't have identity and people can replicate themselves and add fake bids, and B, because the transaction types are very complicated. They're not just like bidding on a single item, they're bidding on sequences of transactions, they're bidding on transactions conditional on some event happening, ... Because of those two things, these kind of mechanisms that in the centralized world people don't like for a bunch of reasons end up being much more popular. And so in this paper, we also show that by using Dutch auctions that are decreasing, you actually have a better way of avoiding some of these congestion problems. And you can kind of, which is sort of somewhat surprising. There's also been recent work that's shown that sort of Dutch auctions are much more Sybil resistant. The auctioneer can't really manipulate them, because if they manipulate them, that means they just bought at a higher price, not a lower price. They're not,
Sure.
And so I think this is one of these things where, like, economists in the centralized world and economics in the decentralized world are completely divorced.
Yeah, so that leads me to my next question. So beyond crypto, and specifically DeFi and crypto trading on decentralized exchanges, what other industries or sectors do you think can stand to benefit from intent-based market framework? Are any other particular applications that you're excited about?
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of governments have kind of proposed having these retail order flow auctions. I think the SEC maybe was the more prominent one. But one interesting thing that we're starting to see right now, especially as crypto starts competing a lot more with TradFi, is that we're starting to see a lot of the features that people expect out of crypto markets bleed into the normal markets. So for instance, there's been a lot of talk about 24 hours US equity trading and sort of automated matching and sort of things where, like, these order flow auctions that market makers have to basically bid on your order flow on and use that to construct a price. And I think the way I view a lot of the more recent stuff, also the fact that the CME wants to compete on spot trading, not just futures trading, is that it's obviously trite to say this now in hindsight, but a lot of the innovations that people have in crypto, you know, I think people in traditional finance end up being forced to adopt. And I generally think the intent markets outside of crypto, when I worked in high frequency trading, there were these kind of markets called ping pools where you would message a market maker and you would ask them for a quote, and then they would respond. It'd be very similar to these intent markets,
Mhm.
except they were fully private, so you couldn't really see how the auction was happening, and you kind of trusted the single market maker. I think the interesting thing is these intent markets actually would, if they were sort of more open, would actually make it much easier for traditional finance to do the transition to 24-hour trading. And I think that's sort of one of the things we're going to see. We're already seeing it, right? Like exchanges are already filing, like traditional exchanges are already filing requests to be open 24 hours and stuff like that. So I think the interesting question to me is, as traditional markets start blending and becoming more like crypto markets, what happens when, the assets that are being used in these intent type of systems are not just, Bitcoin, Ethereum, or your favorite meme coin, but they're actually, some other real world asset because some exchange that is not real, wasn't really a crypto exchange, starts adopting all this technology from crypto to trade other commodities. And
Sure.
I think ironically that seems to be like the direction we're going versus the direction of like, obviously there's a lot of excitement about real world assets coming on chain directly, but I feel like we're also starting to see this idea of existing exchanges adopting crypto standards for real world assets, which is a little bit different than like the crypto native
Sure. Sure.
version.
Well, it's nice. It's nice to see DeFi, having an impact on the, with innovation on traditional markets eventually. So, I mean, drawing from your expertise on both traditional and decentralized finance, what core principles or lessons from classic market design theory do you think are essential for people to understand? I mean, now that looks like there will be intent-based markets coming to TradFi, right? And so, what do people need to understand on from the classic market design theory, basically, to participate, and both users and solvers, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think a thing about classical market theory, and sort of maybe this is the type of thing I was getting at a little bit earlier, was a lot of it when you have a centralized coordinator, you it changes a lot of the dynamics of the different participants, in the sense that, in some cases, maybe in this with the centralized coordinator, you actually do get better prices with more competitors because there's sort of less of this notion of congestion cost. Like they're not competing to use the same resource because the centralized coordinator can just choose, how many resources they are versus a blockchain where there's sort of a fixed amount of resources per unit time. And so increasing the number of participants generally increases prices and you have this congestion type behavior. And so what I think is true, and this is just like a fundamental koan of wisdom from analyzing these things, is oftentimes whatever works in the classical world just doesn't work in the decentralized world, but has just enough of a like similarity that you want to figure out what the common overlap between the two mechanisms are and understand what properties will break in the decentralized world. And oftentimes the things that really break are Sybil resistance. So like if the same entity is able to replicate themselves and participate multiple times, does that change the price that the mechanism gives you? Does that change the behavior? Does that change, what types of participants are involved? The second thing is there's oftentimes way more agents involved than in the centralized world. So, a simple example of this is sort of in a perpetuals futures market on chain. There's oftentimes, roughly speaking, four parties. One party is the person who's making a trade, choosing a directional bet. One party is sort of a liquidity provider, trying to provide liquidity on both sides or capture the funding rate. The third party is someone who's arbitraging, so arbitraging the difference in price between the future and the spot market. And the fourth party is a liquidator, or someone who, when a position goes underwater, buys it out and keeps the system solvent. And oftentimes in centralized exchanges, some or many of those components are done by a single entity. And so when a single entity does that, it changes the dynamics of how the system evolves, right? Versus having to source many participants who are specialized in many different manners for the different subsets. And I think that things in DeFi and crypto that work really well are things where you're able to have multiple roles, but those roles are very specialized and simple on their own, and you don't need too much coordination amongst them. So, people doing the arbitrage causes the price to change, which is used as the coordination mechanism across all of these agents. And I think that's something that the classical economics literature doesn't really deal with. That's actually something that you see more in the sort of multi-agent learning, reinforcement learning, AI literature. And there's sort of this interesting thing where a lot of things from DeFi benefit from a combination of sort of CS thinking from sort of the AI and multi-agent learning side of things, blended with sort of classical economic thinking. And I think one really important thing when you're kind of thinking about designing these systems is to have in these computational constraints in mind of like what things can be computed, how many participants do you need to efficiently compute it, and what kind of guarantees do you want to give the end user?
Yeah. All right, we're almost running out of time, so let's I guess look forward a little bit. So what's on the horizon for your work on intent-based markets and DeFi as a whole? And are there any kind of upcoming initiatives or partnerships that you're excited about? And how do we move forward from here? It's all these promising developments.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think the part of the market that is, you know, very interesting in general is, people who are working on making this multi-chain, multi-rollup world feel like a single chain, like the Solana-like user experience. There's a lot of different ways that's going to happen. Some of them are things like aggregating liquidity across chains and settling, using intents to kind of hide from the end user where their transaction is finally settled, but being able to give them a guarantee, whether it's a zero knowledge proof, a formal cryptographic guarantee, or whether it's a weaker guarantee, but quite hard to fake, such that people don't really have to think as much. And I think that's really where DeFi is going, where a lot of this becomes much less visible to the user, and to them it might just be a Telegram bot.
Okay, great. I feel we could talk a lot longer about all this. It's a very fascinating subject, but we're done here. So it was a pleasure hosting this fireside chat, and looking forward to further developments.
Thanks so much.